The summer heat beat down on Samuel Reed's old pickup truck as it rattled down the dusty road. At 62, Samuel had spent his whole life on this failing farm, just like his father before him. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel, while worry lines creased his weathered face. The bank had given him one last warning about the mortgage payments. He had exactly 30 days to come up with $50,000, or he'd lose everything. The truck's engine coughed as Samuel pulled into the parking lot of Morgan's feed store. He needed chicken feed, but his credit was maxed out. Maybe old. Joe Morgan would let him have one more bag on credit, just until things turned around. Well, if it isn't Samuel Reed, a cold voice called out as Samuel stepped from his truck. Richard Davenport's shiny black Mercedes was parked nearby, looking completely out of place in the dusty lot. The millionaire developer stood there in his $1,000 suit, looking at Samuel like he was something stuck to the bottom of his Italian leather shoes. "Morning, Mr. Davenport," Samuel said quietly, trying to walk past. "Still driving that piece of junk, I see." Richard smirked, adjusting his gold watch. "You know, I could take that worthless farm off your hands. Save you. The embarrassment of foreclosure. I'm thinking a nice golf resort would look perfect there." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. He'd known Richard since high school, back when Richard was just another farm boy. But unlike Samuel, Richard had left for the city, made his fortune in real estate, and came back determined to turn their quiet farming community into what he called a luxury destination. Inside the store, Joe Morgan's normally friendly face looked troubled. "Sorry, Sam. Boss says no more credit. Orders from above." He gestured toward the window where Richard Davenport stood talking on his phone. Samuel's heart sank. Of course. Richard had bought the feed store last month, just like he'd bought the hardware store and the diner, and half the businesses in town. He was slowly squeezing out all the small farmers, one by one. That night, Samuel sat at his kitchen table, staring at a bowl of watery soup. The electricity had been cut off last week, and the only light came from an old kerosene lamp. His chickens needed feed, the tractor needed repairs, and the mortgage payment was due. 50 years of memories lived in these walls. His children had been born here. His wife, Mary, was buried in the small family plot behind the apple orchard. Knock at the door startled him. Samuel opened it to find Richard Davenport standing there with a camera crew and a woman in a business suit. "Mr. Reed," the woman said brightly, "I'm Jennifer Hayes from the Paradise Valley Community Outreach Program. Mr. Davenport has generously offered to visit some of our less fortunate neighbors and share a meal with them. May we come in?" Before Samuel could respond, they pushed past him into the kitchen. The camera lights blazed, nearly blinding him. Richard looked around the dim kitchen with exaggerated concern. "Oh my," Richard said loudly, clearly performing for the cameras. "Is this how you live, Samuel? No electricity, no proper food?" He picked up the soup spoon, letting the thin broth drip back into the bowl. "This is what you call dinner? No wonder. You're failing. A man who can't even feed himself properly has no business running a farm." The camera crew caught every moment of Samuel's humiliation. Richard continued his performance, talking about how some people just can't adapt to modern times and how change is inevitable. Samuel sat silently, his father's words echoing in his head. A Reed never loses his dignity, no matter what. After they left, Samuel walked out to his chicken coop. The old building was falling apart, just like everything else, his dozen remaining. Hens clucked softly in the darkness. These chickens were all he had left of what was once a thriving egg business. His wife Mary had loved these birds, treating each one like a pet. "Sorry, girls," he whispered. "No feed tonight. But tomorrow I'll figure something out." He turned to leave when something caught his eye. In the furthest corner of the coop, partially hidden under some straw, something gleamed in his flashlight beam. Samuel reached down and brushed away the straw. His heart nearly stopped. There, nestled in the corner, was an egg, but not just any egg. This egg was massive, easily 3 times the size of a normal one. And it was golden. Not yellow, not brown, but actually golden. The surface gleamed like polished metal. Samuel picked it up with trembling hands. It was heavy, much heavier than any egg should be. The surface was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with an inner light. "Lord Almighty," Samuel whispered. He had no idea that this moment would change everything. The cameras that had captured his humiliation were long gone, but soon they would be back. And this time the story they told would be very different. Samuel wrapped the golden egg carefully in an old towel and carried it inside. He placed it on his kitchen table, right next to his bowl of watery soup. The egg seemed to glow in the lamplight, casting warm reflections on the worn tablecloth Mary had embroidered so many years ago. For the first time in years, Samuel felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. But as he sat there staring at the miraculous egg, he had no idea that up in his mansion on the hill, Richard Davenport was watching the footage from today's charity visit, laughing with his friends about the poor old farmer and his worthless farm. Neither man knew that their lives were about to change forever. Neither knew that the quiet little farming community of Paradise Valley would soon become the center of a story that would capture the nation's attention. And neither man could possibly imagine how a single golden egg would force them both to reconsider everything they thought they knew about wealth, worth, and what truly makes a man rich. Samuel didn't sleep that night. He kept getting up to check on the golden egg, afraid it might disappear like a dream. By morning, he knew he needed help. Not from the bank, and certainly not from Richard Davenport. He needed someone he could trust. Sarah Chen had been the town's jewelry appraiser for 30 years. Her small shop sat between the drugstore and the post office, and she had a reputation for honesty that even Richard Davenport couldn't buy. When Samuel walked into her shop carrying a wrapped bundle, she was helping Mrs. Johnson pick out a new watch band. "Give me a minute, Sam," Sarah called out. But then she saw his face. In all the years she'd known Samuel Reed, she'd never seen him look so nervous. "Mrs. Johnson, would you mind coming back after lunch? Something's come up." After Mrs. Johnson left, Sarah locked the front door and turned the sign to closed. Samuel's hands shook as he unwrapped the towel. Sarah's eyes went wide. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. She picked up her jeweler's loupe and examined the egg carefully. After what seemed like forever, she looked up at Samuel. "This isn't just gold-colored, Sam. This is solid gold, pure gold. I've never seen anything like it." "How much?" Samuel's voice cracked. "How much do you think it's worth?" Sarah did some quick calculations on her notepad. "At current gold prices, just the metal alone. We're talking millions, Sam, millions. And that's not counting its unique nature. Museums would pay a fortune for something like this." Samuel had to sit down. Millions. His head spun. The mortgage was only $50,000. He could save the farm and still have enough to. The bell over the door jingled as someone tried to open it. Through the glass, they could see Richard Davenport standing there, frowning. Sarah quickly covered the egg. "We're closed," she called out. Richard pointed to his watch and mouthed "important business" through the glass. Sarah shook her head firmly. "Come back tomorrow," she shouted. They watched as Richard stood there for a moment, clearly annoyed at being denied entry. Finally, he turned and walked away, but not before giving Samuel a suspicious look. "Sam," Sarah said quietly, "you need to be careful. Word about something like this will spread fast, and there are people in this town who—" She glanced meaningfully in the direction Richard had gone. "I know," Samuel said. "But what should I do?" Sarah thought for a moment. "My cousin works for the Natural History Museum in the city. Let me call her. This needs to be documented properly, legally." "And Sam?" She squeezed his arm. "Don't tell anyone else, not yet. But secrets have a way of getting out in small towns." By that afternoon, Betty, who worked at the drugstore, was telling everyone how she'd seen Samuel Reed, rushing into Sarah Chen's shop with something wrapped in a towel, and how Sarah had immediately closed the shop, and how Richard Davenport himself had been turned away at the door. The rumors reached Richard's mansion before dinner. He was sitting in his home office, watching the footage from yesterday's charity visit again and laughing about Samuel's pathetic soup dinner when his secretary buzzed him. "Mr. Davenport, there's some strange talk going around town about Samuel Reed and Sarah Chen's jewelry shop, and apparently the Natural History Museum is sending someone out tomorrow morning." Richard's smile faded. What could that old farmer possibly have that would interest a museum? He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Jerry, I need you to do some digging. Find out everything you can about Samuel Reed's activities today, and I mean everything. That night, Samuel sat at his kitchen table again, but this time instead of watery soup, he had hope. Sarah had helped him lock the egg in her shop safe, and tomorrow morning, experts from the museum would arrive to examine it. He looked around his shabby kitchen and allowed himself to dream a little. He could fix the roof, buy new equipment, pay off the mortgage, maybe even start a proper egg business again like Mary had always wanted. The phone rang, startling him. It was Sarah, and she sounded worried. "Sam, someone's been asking questions around town about you, about the shop, about the museum people coming tomorrow. Be careful, okay? Maybe you should stay at my place tonight. I can't leave the farm." "Sarah, the chickens." "The chickens?" "Sam, that's what I wanted to ask you. This egg, where exactly did you find it?" Samuel told her about discovering it in the corner of the coop. "Has anything unusual happened with your chickens lately?" "Anything at all," Samuel thought about it. "Well, last week during that meteor shower, something bright fell in the backfield. I meant to check it out, but with everything else going on." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Sam, tomorrow morning, before the museum people get there, I want you to check that field. If there's anything unusual—" A noise outside interrupted her. Samuel went to the window. In the darkness, he could see flashlight beams moving around the chicken coop. "Someone's here," he whispered into the phone. "Sarah, I'll call you." But before he could finish, the lights went out. Not just his kerosene lamp, but all the yard. Lights too. In the sudden darkness, he heard his chickens start to panic, and then he heard footsteps on his front porch. Samuel's heart pounded as the footsteps got closer. The phone in his hand was dead. The line had gone silent. In the pitch darkness, he heard his screen door creak open. "Mr. Reed?" a woman's voice called out. "This is Detective Linda Martinez, Paradise Valley Police. Can you come to the door, please?" Samuel fumbled for his flashlight. When he opened the door, he found not only Detective Martinez, but also 4 other police officers and Sarah Chen. "Sam!" Sarah rushed past the detective to hug him. "When the phone went dead, I called the police. I saw 2 men in dark clothes, heading this way from the diner." Detective Martinez nodded to her officers, who spread out to search the property. "Mr. Reed, Ms. Chen told us about your discovery. She was right to be concerned. We found fresh footprints around your chicken coop, and your power lines have been deliberately cut." A shout came from the backfield. "Detective, you need to see this." In the beam of police flashlights, they could all see it. A circular patch of scorched earth about 10 feet across. In the center was what looked like a small crater, and scattered around it were tiny pieces of what looked like metal, but they glowed with a faint golden light. "This is where that meteor hit last week," Samuel explained. "I never got around to checking it out." Detective Martinez picked up one of the glowing fragments with a gloved hand. "Mr. Reed, I'm going to need you to tell me everything, from the beginning." While Samuel talked, more police cars arrived. The whole farm was lit up with red and blue flashing lights. News travels fast in small towns, and soon cars were pulling up along the road, people getting out to see what was happening. At the Reed farm, among them was Richard Davenport. He stood at the edge of the property, watching everything through expensive binoculars. His face grew darker as he saw the police gathering evidence from the crater. Then he saw 2 men in dark clothes trying to sneak away through his own property, heading toward the mansion. Richard quickly pulled out his phone. "Jerry, get rid of them now and delete everything." But it was too late. The police had already caught the men. As they were handcuffed and led to police cars, one of them looked straight at Richard's hiding spot. Richard quickly ducked behind a tree, but Detective Martinez had noticed the movement. By morning, the story was everywhere. Local news vans clogged the dirt road leading to Samuel's farm. The headline on Paradise Valley's online news site read, "Miracle on Reed Farm. Golden egg discovered after meteor strike." The Natural History Museum team arrived in a convoy of vehicles. They were joined by scientists from NASA, geologists from 3 universities, and even representatives from the governor's office. Samuel's quiet farm had become the center of the biggest story in the country. In his mansion, Richard Davenport watched the news coverage with growing anger. The 2 men who'd been caught, both ex-military security contractors he'd hired through Jerry, were singing like canaries to avoid serious charges. His name hadn't come up yet, but it was only a matter of time. "Sir?" His secretary knocked nervously on his office door. The police are here, and there are reporters outside the gate." Richard straightened his tie and put on his most charming smile. He'd handled crises before. This would be no different. But when Detective Martinez walked in, she wasn't alone. With her was Sarah Chen, and she was carrying a very familiar-looking laptop. "Mr. Davenport," Detective Martinez said, "we'd like to talk about the footage from your recent charity visit to Mr. Reed's farm, particularly the raw footage that wasn't aired, the parts where you discussed your plans for his property with your camera crew." Back at the farm, Samuel sat in a folding chair watching the scientists examine his chicken coop. They'd found traces of the same strange, glowing metal fragments inside. His chickens had been pecking at them for days before. "Producing the golden egg, Mr. Reed?" A young scientist approached him excitedly. "We've analyzed the egg. It's not just gold, it's an entirely new element, something never seen before on Earth. The implications for science, for technology, this could change everything." Samuel nodded politely, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Mary, about how she'd always insisted they keep the farm going even when things were at their worst. "There's magic in this land," she used to say. "You just have to have faith." The scientists had offered him more money than he could imagine for the egg and exclusive rights to study the meteor site. The governor was talking about declaring the farm a site of scientific significance, which would protect it from developers forever. And the university wanted to set up a research station right there on his property. But what made Samuel happiest was watching his chickens scratch in the dirt, just like they always had. Some of them had started laying normal eggs again, but now each egg had tiny flecks of gold in the yolk. The scientists said they were perfectly safe to eat. In fact, they might even have health benefits they were just beginning to understand. Sarah brought him a cup of coffee and sat down beside him. The early morning sun made the dew on the grass sparkle like diamonds. "Your Mary would be proud," she said softly. "She always said there was magic here," Samuel replied. "Guess she was right all along." In town, life was changing fast. The diner was full of scientists and reporters. The motels were booked solid. The feed stores, which the bank had mysteriously foreclosed on after Richard Davenport's arrest, was now being run by Joe Morgan again, its rightful owner. But the biggest change was in how people looked at Samuel Reed. The man they'd all pitied, the poor old farmer who couldn't keep up with the times, was now being called a pioneer, a discoverer, a man who'd kept faith in his land when everyone else had given up. And every morning, just like always, Samuel got up at dawn to feed his chickens. But now he wasn't alone. Students and scientists followed him around, taking notes on everything he did. They called it observing traditional farming practices in conjunction with extraterrestrial materials. Samuel just called it doing his chores. One morning, about a week after everything had happened, he found another golden egg in the coop. This one was smaller than the first, but it had strange markings on the shell that seemed to shift and change in the light. The scientists were ecstatic. The governor called personally. The news crews set up their cameras again, but Samuel just carefully wrapped the egg in a soft cloth, just like he had with the first one, and called Sarah to let her know. Some things, he had learned, didn't need to be rushed. Some magic needed time to reveal itself. And sometimes the richest man wasn't the one with the biggest house on the hill, but the one who had faith in the simple things, like an old farm, a flock of chickens, and the enduring power of love and patience. Richard Davenport sat in the Paradise Valley Police Station's interrogation room, his expensive suit wrinkled after hours of questioning. His lawyer, a nervous man named Peterson, wiped sweat from his forehead as Detective Martinez laid out photos on the table. "Let's go through this again," Martinez said, pointing to surveillance photos of the two men caught on Samuel's farm. "These men work for your security company. They were caught cutting power lines and attempting to break into Mr. Reed's chicken coop. And now they're saying you hired them to find something valuable. My client exercises his right to remain silent." Peterson jumped in quickly. "That's fine," Martinez smiled. "We have plenty to talk about. Like this laptop Sarah Chen brought us." She opened it and played a video. It showed Richard talking to his camera crew before the charity visit to Samuel's farm. "Make sure you get Plenty of shots of how rundown everything is. Richard's voice came clearly through the speakers. I need this place to look as pathetic as possible. Once the bank forecloses next month, the zoning board will have to approve my resort plans. Nobody wants a failed farm bringing down property values. Richard's face turned red as he watched himself on screen. But Detective Martinez wasn't done. She pulled out more photos, documents showing how Richard had pressured the bank to call in Samuel's loan early, emails proving he'd bought up businesses just to squeeze local farmers, and evidence that he'd been bribing county officials. You know what I find interesting, Martinez said. All this happened before the golden egg was discovered. You weren't trying to steal the egg that night. You were just trying to force Sam off his land. But when you heard about his visit to Sarah's shop, you got greedy. Down the hall, in another room, Jerry Watson, Richard's right-hand man, was telling his own story to federal investigators. About tax fraud, about threatened witnesses, about years of schemes that had helped build Richard's real estate empire. Meanwhile, Samuel's farm had become something like a small town itself. The university had set up climate-controlled research pods near the crater site. Scientists lived in temporary housing units that looked like something from a space movie, but they'd been careful to keep it all away from the main farmhouse and the chicken coop, respecting Samuel's wish to keep farming like he always had. Sarah had moved into Samuel's guest room, saying he needed someone to help handle all the media requests and business proposals that kept coming in. But anyone could see there was more to it than that. The way they sat together on the porch in the evenings, sharing coffee and watching the sunset, reminded older folks in town of how Samuel and Mary used to be. One morning, Sarah was making breakfast when she heard Samuel calling from the chicken coop. She ran out to find him staring at something amazing. All 12 of his remaining chickens had laid eggs overnight. Each egg was different. One was silver, another seemed to be made of crystal. One looked like it was made of some kind of glowing blue metal. The meteor fragments, one of the scientists explained later that day. They're not just creating gold, they're combining with the chicken's natural egg-laying process to create new elements that shouldn't even be possible according to our current understanding of physics. The governor declared the farm a state scientific treasure. Offers came in from pharmaceutical companies wanting to study the egg's potential medical properties. Technology firms wanted to research the new elements for possible industrial uses. But Samuel insisted that everything be done carefully, naturally, without hurting his chickens or changing the way he farmed. My Mary always said you had to respect the land, he told reporters. You can't rush nature's miracles. In town, things were changing too. The Paradise Valley Bank got new management after evidence of corruption came to light. Joe Morgan expanded the feed store to include a small museum about the farm's discovery. Betty from the drugstore started a thriving business giving tours to visitors, telling them the whole story of Samuel Reed and the golden egg. But the biggest surprise came from Richard Davenport's mansion. After his arrest, investigators discovered that much of his fortune had been built on fraud. The mansion and all his properties were seized by the government. And guess who ended up buying the mansion at auction? Sarah Chen's cousin from the Natural History Museum had an idea. The mansion became the Paradise Valley Scientific Research Center, with laboratories, conference rooms, and housing for visiting scientists. The gates that once kept everyone out were replaced with a welcome center for students and tourists, and Samuel, he just kept farming. Every morning he still got up at dawn to feed his chickens, but now he had company on his morning rounds. Sarah would walk with him, their hands clasped together, talking about simple things while the scientists followed, behind with their instruments and notebooks. The chickens kept laying their miraculous eggs, gold, silver, crystal, and other materials that didn't even have names yet. Each one was carefully documented and studied. But Samuel made sure that his chickens were still allowed to be chickens, scratching in the dirt and clucking in the sunshine. One evening, as Samuel and Sarah sat on the porch drinking coffee, a familiar red Ferrari came crawling up the dirt road. Richard Davenport, out on bail and awaiting trial, stopped at the gate. He got out and stood there for a long moment, looking at the farm he'd tried so hard to destroy. Now it was worth more than his entire empire had ever been. Samuel walked down to the gate, The two men looked at each other through the bars that Richard himself had put up years ago. "You know what the funny thing is, Richard?" Samuel said quietly. "If you'd just been patient, if you'd respected the land and the people on it, you might have been part of all this. Mary always said there was enough magic here for everyone." Richard opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. He got back in his Ferrari and drove away. It was the last time anyone in Paradise Valley ever saw him. That night in the chicken coop, another egg appeared. This one was different from all the others. It seemed to be made of some kind of metal that caught and held the light of the setting sun, glowing like a captured piece of twilight. Sarah held Samuel's hand as they looked at it. "What do you think this one means?" she asked. Samuel smiled. "Mary used to say that every sunrise brings new possibilities. Maybe that's what all these eggs are, nature's way of showing us that miracles are still possible if we just have faith and patience." Around them, the chickens clucked softly in the gathering dark, while up at the research center, lights twinkled in the windows of what had once been Richard's mansion. The evening breeze carried the scent of apple blossoms from the old orchard, where Mary rested, and somewhere in the vast universe that had chosen to drop a piece of itself onto this small farm in Paradise Valley, perhaps other miracles were waiting to be discovered. But for Samuel Reed, the greatest miracle was already here. The simple joy of working his land, caring for his chickens, and finding love again when he least expected it. The media circus around Paradise Valley was about to get even bigger. Sleek private helicopter landed on the newly built helipad near the research center, and out stepped Victoria Davenport, Richard's ex-wife. She hadn't been seen in Paradise Valley for 15 years, not since their bitter divorce. But now she was back, and she had something to say. "I want to make things right," Victoria told Detective Martinez at the police station. "Richard didn't just steal from the people of Paradise Valley. He stole from me too, and I have proof." Victoria opened her designer handbag and pulled out a thick folder of documents. They showed how Richard had hidden millions during their divorce, using the same schemes he'd later used to pressure local farmers. But more importantly, they showed where that money had gone. The resort plans weren't just about greed, Victoria explained. Richard was laundering money through his development projects, and Samuel Reed's farm was supposed to be the biggest one yet. While the police and FBI agents pored over Victoria's documents, life at the farm continued its new normal. Sarah had officially moved in with Samuel, and the old farmhouse was starting to feel like a home again. She'd planted fresh flowers in Mary's garden, with Samuel's blessing. That morning, something extraordinary happened in the chicken coop. One of the hens, the oldest one, which Mary had named Betty White, laid an egg unlike any they'd seen before. This egg seemed to change colors as you looked at it, shifting through every shade of the rainbow. The scientists were fascinated, of course. But what really caught everyone's attention was what happened when sunlight hit it. The egg projected what looked like moving images onto the wall of the coop. They were blurry at first, but as Samuel watched, he could make out what looked like landscapes from another world. "It's some kind of recording device," one of the younger scientists explained excitedly. "The meteor material isn't just creating new elements, it's storing and transmitting information." News of this discovery brought even more attention to Paradise Valley. The governor came for a personal visit. NASA sent a special team. Even the military showed interest, though Samuel politely but firmly turned them away. "This isn't about weapons or power," he told them. "This is about understanding, about learning." But not everyone got that message. Late one night, an alarm went off at the research center. Someone had broken into the secure storage facility where the special eggs were kept. Security cameras caught a familiar face, Jerry Watson, Richard's former right-hand man, who was supposed to be under house arrest. The police caught him before he could escape, but he wasn't working alone. In his pocket, they found a burner phone with text messages from a number in the Cayman Islands. Richard Davenport might be under house arrest, too, but he wasn't done causing trouble. Sarah was shaken by the break-in attempt. "Maybe we need better security," she suggested to Samuel over breakfast. The government offered to send guards. Samuel shook his head. Mary always said that fear was the opposite of faith. We'll protect what we have, but we won't live in fear, as ours say. If, to prove his point, that very morning 3 more chickens laid special eggs. One seemed to be made of a material that floated in mid-air. Another gave off a soft humming sound that made all the plants nearby grow faster. The third looked normal until you touched it. Then it showed you memories like a personal movie screen in your mind. Victoria Davenport surprised everyone by asking to visit the farm. She stood in the chicken coop, tears in her eyes, as Samuel showed her the miraculous eggs. Richard never understood, she said softly. He always thought power came from taking things from others. He never learned that real wealth comes from what you give back. She turned to Samuel and Sarah. I want to make you an offer. The money Richard hid from me, I want to use it to set up a foundation, the Reed Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture and Scientific Discovery. You two would run it. We could help other small farmers fund research, maybe even find more meteor sites. Samuel and Sarah looked at each other. It was a lot to think about, but before they could answer, one of the scientists came running from the research center. You need to see this, he shouted. The rainbow egg, it's showing us something new. They all hurried to the lab where the rainbow egg was kept in a special chamber. The images it was projecting were clearer now. They showed what looked like a star map, with one particular star highlighted. We think, the scientist paused, barely able to contain his excitement. We think it's telling us where the meteor came from. Victoria's eyes widened. The Foundation could fund a space program. We could actually go there. Samuel laughed. Let's start smaller. Maybe help some local farmers first. But Sarah was looking thoughtful. Why not both? Mary always said dreams should be as big as the sky. That evening, as the sun set over Paradise Valley, Samuel and Sarah sat in their usual spots on the porch. Victoria had gone back to her hotel to start working on the Foundation paperwork. The scientists were still excitedly analyzing the star map. And somewhere in the world, Richard Davenport was probably plotting his next move. But none of that seemed to matter much right now. What mattered was the peace of the evening, the soft clucking of chickens settling down for the night, and the way Sarah's hand felt in Samuel's as they watched the first stars come out. Mary would like you, Samuel said quietly. She always said love was like farming. You had to nurture it every day, not just when it was convenient. Sarah squeezed his hand. She sounds like a wise woman. I wish I could have known her. In a way you do, Samuel replied. Everything good that's happening here, it's all growing from seeds she helped plant. The love, the patience, the faith. A shooting star streaked across the darkening sky. They both made silent wishes, though anyone could guess what they might be wishing for. More miracles, more love, more chances to help others. Perhaps all of those things, but mostly they wished for the wisdom to handle whatever miracles tomorrow might bring. Because on Samuel Reed's farm, every day brought something new and wonderful, as long as you had the faith to see it. News of the star map spread like wildfire through the scientific community. Within days, Paradise Valley was flooded with astronomers from around the world. They set up powerful telescopes on the hills surrounding Samuel's farm, all pointed at the mysterious star system shown in the rainbow eggs projection. But an even bigger surprise was waiting in the chicken coop that morning. Betty White, the old hen who'd laid the rainbow egg, was sitting on a nest made entirely of glowing meteor fragments, and underneath her was an egg that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. It's alive, whispered Dr. Emily Zhang, the lead scientist from NASA. Whatever's in that egg, it's alive. The discovery caused a storm of debate. Some scientists wanted to take the egg to a secure facility for study. Others argued it should be left exactly where it was. Government officials arrived with papers claiming national security interests, but Samuel stood firm. This egg stays right here, he said quietly but firmly. Whatever's growing in there chose this place, these chickens. We need to respect that. Sarah backed him up, and surprisingly so did Victoria Davenport. The foundation she'd set up was already gaining influence, and her lawyers helped keep the farm independent from government control. But not everyone was happy about the situation. In Okao, his luxury apartment under house arrest, Richard Davenport watched the news coverage with growing rage. His phone rang, a call from an unlisted number. Mr. Davenport, I represent certain interested parties. We have the resources to get what we want from that farm. All we need is your local knowledge." Richard smiled for the first time in weeks. "Tell me more." Back at the farm, life had taken on an almost magical quality. The pulsing egg seemed to affect everything around it. Flowers bloomed out of season. Fruit trees produced golden apples with healing properties. Even the weather seemed perfect every day. Samuel and Sarah had started planning their wedding. They wanted a simple ceremony in the apple orchard, near Mary's resting place. Victoria was helping with the arrangements, and the whole town was excited. "Mary would want us to celebrate life," Samuel said one evening, as they looked through old photo albums. "She always said joy shared is joy multiplied." But dark clouds were gathering. Security cameras caught suspicious movements in the woods around the farm. Strange signals interfered with the research equipment, and Betty White, the special hen, became increasingly agitated. One night, Sarah woke up to find Samuel's side of the bed empty. She found him in the chicken coop, sitting with Betty White. "Something's wrong," he said. "She's trying to tell us something." As if in response, all the special eggs they'd collected started to glow at once. The rainbow egg's projection changed, showing what looked like a warning. But before they could understand it, all the lights in Paradise Valley went out. In the darkness, they heard, "Helicopters, get down!" Sarah pulled Samuel to the ground as bright spotlights swept across the farm. Men in black tactical gear rappelled from the helicopters, while others emerged from the woods. But they hadn't counted on Betty White. The old hen suddenly stood up from her nest, and the pulsing egg began to glow brighter than ever. A wave of golden light spread out from the chicken coop, and every piece of electronic equipment the intruders carried simply stopped working. Their helicopter's engines died, leaving them hovering helplessly before slowly, safely settling to the ground. "Don't move!" Detective Martinez's voice rang out. She and her officers had been watching the farm, expecting something like this. They quickly arrested the intruders, who turned out to be mercenaries hired by a shadowy international organization, with Richard Davenport's help. As the sun rose over the chaos, Betty White settled back on her nest as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. The pulsing egg was glowing brighter than ever, and tiny cracks had appeared in its shell. "It's time," Samuel said softly. The whole town gathered to watch. Scientists readied their instruments. News crews set up their cameras. But Betty White wouldn't let anyone too close to her nest. Hours passed. The cracks grew larger, and then, just as the sun reached its highest point, the egg began to open. Golden light poured out, so bright that everyone had to look away. When they could see again, there was something extraordinary in the nest. It looked like a chick, but unlike any they'd ever seen. Its feathers shimmered with all the colors of the rainbow and seemed to catch and hold the light. Its eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. And most incredibly, where its feet touched the ground, tiny flowers sprouted instantly. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, holding Samuel's hand. "It's a miracle," someone in the crowd said. "No," Samuel replied, thinking of Mary, of Sarah, of all the love and faith that had brought them to this moment. "It's just life. Doing what life does best. Growing, changing, creating new wonders." The strange chick looked at them all with its wise eyes and then did something that made everyone gasp. Here it spoke, not in words exactly, but in feelings and images that everyone could understand. It showed them visions of its home world, of the journey that had brought the meteor to Earth, and of the future it saw for humanity. "It chose us, Doctor," Zhang said in amazement. "It chose this farm, these chickens, this place, to show us what's possible when we work with nature instead of against it." Victoria Davenport stepped forward. "The Foundation will protect this place forever. No one will ever threaten it again." But Samuel was looking at Sarah and at the simple gold ring on her finger that matched the one on his. "The best protection," he said, "is love. Mary taught me that, and now I get to share it again." As if agreeing, Betty White clucked softly, and the magical chick nestled under her wing. Above them, the stars were coming out, including the one that had sent them this miracle. In his apartment, Richard Davenport was being arrested again, this time with no chance of bail. But he was smiling. He'd finally understood something, though too late. The real treasure had never been gold or power or money. It had been there all along, in the simple things he'd spent his life trying to destroy, and in the chicken coupon. Samuel Reed's farm, a new chapter was beginning, one that would change not just Paradise Valley but the whole world, one miracle at a time. The magical chick, which everyone had started calling Aurora, grew faster than any normal chicken. Within a week it was fully grown, its feathers shimmering with otherworldly colors. But what amazed everyone most was how it communicated with the other chickens, especially Betty White, who had become like a mother to it. Word of Aurora spread. Around the world, religious leaders called it a sign. Scientists said it was proof of intelligent life beyond Earth. But for Samuel and Sarah, it was simply part of their growing family. The wedding. Plans continued, though they had to change the location. The apple orchard couldn't hold all the people who wanted to attend. Victoria suggested using the grounds of the research center, but Samuel and Sarah had a better idea. We'll have it right. Here in the chicken yard, Sarah announced, this is where our story really began. Betty White and Aurora seemed to approve, as flowers suddenly bloomed all around the chicken coop. But their happiness was about to be tested again. One morning, Dr. Zhang rushed into the farmhouse with alarming news. The star map, she said breathlessly. We've detected something coming from that same star system. Something big. Samuel and Sarah followed her to the research center. The massive telescopes were all focused on one point in the sky. On the computer screens, they could see what looked like a ship, heading straight for Earth. It'll be here in 3 days, Dr. Zhang explained. The government wants to evacuate the farm. They're talking about military responses. Before they could discuss it further, Aurora started making a sound they'd never heard before. It was like singing, but it made the air itself vibrate. All the special eggs they'd collected began to glow, and the rainbow egg projected new images. It's not a threat, Sarah realized, watching the images. They're coming for a reunion. The next 3 days were chaos. Military vehicles rolled into Paradise Valley. News crews broadcast non-stop. Politicians argued about how to respond. But Samuel, Sarah, and Victoria stood firm. There would be no evacuation, no military intervention. If they wanted to hurt us, they wouldn't have sent Aurora first, Samuel explained to anyone who would listen. Mary always said strangers are just friends we haven't met yet. The night before the ship was due to arrive, Samuel found Sarah in Mary's garden. She was crying. What if everything changes? She asked. What if we lose all this? Samuel took her hand. Change isn't always bad. Look at us. Look at how my life changed when you came into it. Mary used to say that love is like a seed. It grows into something you couldn't imagine, but it's beautiful anyway. Inside the chicken coop, Aurora and Betty White sat together, their soft clucking almost like they were having their own conversation about tomorrow. The big day dawned clear and bright. The ship was visible now, even without telescopes, a golden disk hanging in the morning sky. As it got closer, it began to glow with the same rainbow colors as Aurora's feathers. Betty White led all the chickens out of the coop, with Aurora walking beside her. They formed a perfect circle in the yard, and Aurora began to sing. The ship responded with a harmony that made the whole valley vibrate. It descended slowly, gracefully, finally hovering just above the chicken yard. It was smaller up close than it had looked in the telescopes, about the size of Samuel's old barn. A beam of rainbow light shot down from the ship, and 3 figures appeared. They looked almost human, but their skin shimmered like Aurora's feathers, and their eyes held the same ancient wisdom. Aurora ran to them, singing joyfully. The aliens, though that word didn't seem quite right, bowed deeply to Betty White, who clucked importantly and ruffled her feathers. Then they turned to Samuel and Sarah. Without speaking, they shared visions of their world, a peaceful place where nature and technology lived in perfect harmony. They showed how they'd sent the meteor, hoping to find others who understood that balance. They want to share their knowledge, Dr. Zhang translated unnecessarily. Everyone could feel the aliens' intentions, but only if we promise to use it wisely. Samuel looked at Sarah, then at Victoria, who nodded. The Reed Foundation would make sure of that. Mary would say yes, he said softly. Sarah squeezed his hand. Then so do we. The aliens smiled, an expression that looked surprisingly human. They raised their hands, and suddenly every chicken on the farm laid an egg at exactly the same moment. Each egg was different, containing not just new elements but new possibilities. "These are seeds," the aliens communicated. "Seeds of change, of growth, of harmony between worlds." As scientists scrambled to collect the eggs, Victoria stepped forward with an idea. "We can set up sister farms around the world, places where people can learn this new way of living. The foundation will fund it all." The aliens nodded approvingly. They hadn't come to take Aurora away. She was a bridge between their worlds, meant to stay on Earth. But they would return regularly to check on their seeds and share more knowledge. As the ship prepared to leave, Samuel felt Mary's presence stronger than ever. He could almost hear her laugh, could almost see her nodding in satisfaction at how everything had turned out. The alien's departure was like a sunset in reverse, painting the sky with impossible colors. Betty White watched them go with what could only be described as a proud mother's satisfaction. Aurora sang one last farewell, and flowers bloomed everywhere the sound touched. That evening, as Paradise Valley settled back into something like normal, Samuel and Sarah sat in their usual spots on the porch. Aurora perched between them, her feathers glowing softly in the dusk. "You know what Mary would say about all this?" Samuel asked. Sarah smiled. "That it's just another kind of love story?" "Exactly." He looked out at his farm, still the same but somehow more magical than ever. A love story between two worlds, between past and future, between simple faith and infinite possibilities. In the chicken coop, Betty White settled down for the night, surrounded by her special family of Earth chickens and one alien bird. The new eggs glowed softly, promising tomorrows filled with wonders. And somewhere up there, their new friends were heading home, carrying with them stories about a small farm in Paradise Valley, where love and faith had built a bridge between the stars. The morning of Samuel and Sarah's wedding dawned bright and clear. The chicken yard had been transformed overnight, not by decorators, but by Aurora's singing. Flowers of impossible colors bloomed everywhere, their petals shimmering with rainbow light. Betty White had organized all the chickens into perfect rows, like feathered wedding guests. Victoria had worried about having a wedding in a chicken yard, but now she stood amazed at the beauty of it all. "This is better than any five-star venue," she admitted, watching Aurora direct the other chickens like a conductor leading an orchestra. The whole town had turned out for the ceremony. Even the scientists took a break from their research to attend. Dr. Zhang had tears in her eyes as she helped Sarah with her simple white dress. "You know," Sarah said, looking at herself in the mirror, "when I first came to Paradise Valley, I thought I was just running away from my old life, my fancy city job, my failed relationships. I never expected to find all this." Dr. Zhang smiled. "Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we don't expect." Meanwhile, in his bedroom, Samuel was putting on his best suit, the same one he'd worn the day Richard Davenport had humiliated him in front of the cameras. But now it felt different. Now it felt like a symbol of how far he'd come. A soft clucking at the window made him turn. Betty White was there, holding something in her beak. It was a small, perfectly round egg that looked like it was made of pearl. "Is it this your wedding gift, old girl?" Samuel asked, carefully taking the egg. As soon as he touched it, he felt Mary's presence stronger than ever. Tears filled his eyes as memories flooded through him. Not sad memories, but happy ones, full of love and blessing. The ceremony was unlike any wedding Paradise Valley had ever seen. As Samuel and Sarah exchanged their vows, Aurora sang a song that made the air shimmer with colors. Betty White stood proudly between them, like a feathered minister. And at the exact moment they kissed, every chicken on the farm laid an egg. Simultaneously, each one a perfect pearl like the one Betty White had given Samuel. "These aren't just eggs," Dr. Zhang discovered later. "They're like tiny memory crystals. Each one holds different images, different feelings. It's like they've captured this moment forever." But an even bigger surprise was waiting at the reception. Victoria stood up to make her announcement. "As my wedding gift to you both," she said, "the Reed Foundation is expanding. We're not just going to set up sister farms around the world. We're going to create a whole new kind of community here in Paradise Valley." Sustainable housing, green energy, research facilities, all built around the principles we've learned from. Our visitors, a place where people can come to learn how to live in harmony with nature and technology. She paused, smiling at Samuel and Sarah. And you two will be in charge of it all, if you want to be, of course. Before they could answer, Aurora started singing again. The pearl eggs all began to glow, projecting images into the air. They showed a vision of Paradise Valley's future, green buildings nestled among farms, children learning from both human teachers and alien technology, and at the center of it all, Samuel's farm, still simple, still true to its roots. Mary would love it, Samuel said softly. Sarah squeezed his hand. Then so will we. But their happiness was about to face one final test. As the reception continued, a guard came running up to Victoria. "Richard's escaped," he said breathlessly. "He disabled his ankle monitor somehow, and he's not alone." Security cameras had caught Richard Davenport being picked up by a black helicopter. The same shadowy organization that had tried to raid the farm was making one last desperate attempt. "They'll be coming here," Victoria said. "They still think they can steal our secrets." But Samuel just smiled. "Let them come," he said. "We've got something they'll never understand." As if on cue, Betty White started gathering her flock. Aurora's feathers began to glow brighter than ever. And all around the farm, the special eggs they'd collected over the months began to pulse with light. The black helicopter appeared on the horizon just as the sun was setting. But before it could get close, Aurora began to sing. The sound was different this time, not just beautiful but powerful. Every chicken on the farm joined in, creating a harmony that made the air itself vibrate. The helicopter's engines sputtered and died, just like before. But this time something else happened. As the aircraft made an emergency landing in the field, Richard Davenport and his mysterious allies stepped out, ready to fight. Then the pearl eggs from the wedding began to glow. Each one projected not just memories, but feelings: love, joy, peace, hope. The mercenaries dropped their weapons, overwhelmed by emotions they couldn't understand. Richard fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." And he meant it. For the first time in his life, Richard Davenport understood what real wealth was. He saw how empty his life had been, chasing money and power while missing the true miracles all around him. Victoria walked over to her ex-husband. "It's not too late to change," she said softly. "That's what this place teaches us. It's never too late for miracles." As the police led Richard and his companions away, Samuel and Sarah looked at each other. Their wedding day hadn't gone exactly as planned, but somehow it was perfect anyway. "Mary always said love was the greatest power in the universe," Samuel said. "I guess now we know she was right." Aurora sang one more song as the stars came out, a lullaby that made everyone feel at peace. Betty White settled her flock for the night, clucking contentedly. And in Mary's garden, new flowers were blooming, pearls growing like dewdrops on their petals. The scientists would later say that the events of that day had changed the very molecular structure of Paradise Valley. That the combination of alien technology, chicken biology, and pure love had created something entirely new in the universe. But for Samuel and Sarah, wrapped in each other's arms on their wedding night, it was simpler than that. It was just love. Doing what love does best, creating miracles one moment at a time. 1 year had passed since the magical wedding day. Paradise Valley had transformed in ways nobody could have imagined. The Reed Foundation's sustainable community was taking shape, with beautiful green buildings that seemed to grow right out of the earth. But Samuel's farm remained unchanged at its heart, a simple place where miracles happened every day. Richard Davenport had surprised everyone by pleading guilty to all charges. He asked to serve his sentence helping at one of the Reed Foundation's new sister farms in Arizona, working with his hands in the dirt for the first time since he was young. Victoria visited him sometimes and reported that he was slowly becoming the man she'd first fallen in love with, back before money and power poisoned his heart. But the biggest changes were happening at Samuel and Sarah's farm. Aurora had grown into her role as bridge between two worlds. Every morning, she would sing to the crops, making them grow strong and healthy. At night, she would send messages to her homeworld through songs that made the stars themselves seem to twinkle in response. Betty White had become something of a celebrity herself. Her pearl eggs, which she now laid once a month under the full moon, were treasured not for their monetary value but for their ability to share memories and emotions. People came from around the world to receive one, always leaving changed by the experience. Sarah had just discovered she was pregnant, and the whole farm seemed to celebrate the news. The chickens laid eggs with shells that spelled out "Congratulations" in shimmering letters. Aurora's song made flowers bloom in the shape of tiny baby footprints. Even the mysterious aliens sent a gift, a small crystal that, when touched, showed visions of the baby's possible futures. "It's a girl," Sarah told Samuel one morning after touching the crystal, "and she's going to be special." Samuel smiled, thinking of how Mary would have loved being a grandmother. "Every child is special," he said, remembering Mary's words, but their daughter would indeed be unique. The scientists discovered that the alien influence, combined with living so close to Aurora and the magical chickens, had affected her development. The ultrasound showed tiny patterns on her skin that looked like Aurora's feathers. "She'll be a bridge too," Dr. Zhang explained excitedly, "born of Earth, but touched by the stars." The news brought reporters back to Paradise Valley, but the farm's protective energy kept them at a respectful distance. The flowers Aurora had made bloom at the wedding had spread throughout the valley, creating natural barriers that somehow knew friend from foe. One quiet evening, as Samuel and Sarah sat in their usual spots on the porch, they had an unexpected visitor. Betty White came marching up the steps, followed by Aurora and carrying something in her beak. It was a new kind of egg, one they'd never seen before. This egg was clear as glass but seemed to hold galaxies inside it. When Betty White placed it in Sarah's lap, it began to pulse in time with the baby's heartbeat. "It's a gift," Sarah understood somehow. "For our daughter." Aurora sang softly, and the egg projected images into the air. They saw their daughter, growing up, running through fields of glowing flowers, talking with chickens, singing songs that made the earth and sky respond. They saw her bringing people together, helping them understand the connection between all living things. They saw her visiting the alien world someday, walking among beings of light and energy, learning secrets that would help both worlds grow, stronger together. But most importantly, they saw her here on this simple farm, gathering eggs and feeding chickens, just like her father had done all his life. She would be extraordinary, but she would also be grounded in the ordinary magic of everyday life. The next day, Victoria called with exciting news. The first harvest had come in from the sister farms around the world. Every single plant grown from the magical seeds had produced something miraculous. Wheat that could grow in the desert, rice that purified polluted water as it grew, corn that could communicate with other plants, sharing nutrients and helping the whole ecosystem thrive. "We're calling it cosmic agriculture," Victoria explained. "But really, it's just what Mary always said. Love makes things grow." Samuel walked out to Mary's resting place in the apple orchard. The trees were heavy with golden fruit, each apple containing tiny stars in its core. He sat on the bench he'd built there, feeling the life pulsing all around him. "You were right, Mary," he said softly. "About everything. About love being the greatest power. About having faith in the simple things. About miracles being everywhere if you just know how to look." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the scent of apple blossoms, even though it was harvest time. Samuel smiled, knowing Mary was still here, still part of the magic that made this place special. Back at the house, Sarah was sitting in the kitchen, her hands resting on her growing belly. Aurora was teaching the newest batch of chicks to sing, their tiny voices joining in a chorus that made rainbows dance across the walls. Betty White supervised it all with her usual dignified air. The crystal egg the aliens had given them sat on a special shelf, showing glimpses of possible futures like a cosmic kaleidoscope. But Sarah wasn't watching it. She was looking out the window at the simple chicken yard where their story had begun. "Our daughter will have such amazing things in her life," she said when Samuel came in. alien technology, magical chickens, miracles. Every day. But you know what the most amazing thing will be? Samuel sat beside her, taking her hand. What's that? That she'll grow up knowing what really matters. Not the magic itself, but what makes the magic possible. Love, faith, simple kindness. All the things Mary taught you. All the things this farm represents. Aurora sang in agreement, and every chicken on the farm joined in. The sound carried across Paradise Valley, touching everything with its gentle power. In his cell at the minimum security farm, Richard Davenport heard it and smiled, his hands dirty from honest work. In her office at the foundation, Victoria heard it and knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. And somewhere in the vast reaches of space, beings of light and energy heard it too. They had chosen well when they sent that meteor to Earth. They had found not just a place, but a people who understood that the greatest technologies, the deepest magic, and the strongest power all came from the same simple source. Love. Just as Mary had always said. The day Sarah went into labor, the whole of Paradise Valley lit up with aurora lights, even though it was midsummer. Aurora's song filled the air, a melody so beautiful it brought tears to everyone's eyes. Every chicken on the farm laid eggs that glowed like stars, and Betty White paraded proudly around the yard as if she personally had arranged everything. In the hospital room, Sarah held Samuel's hand, while Dr. Zhang, who had insisted on being their doctor, prepared for the delivery. The crystal egg the aliens had given them pulsed with rainbow light in time with Sarah's contractions. Mary would love all this fuss, Samuel said, trying to make Sarah smile through her pain. Just then, Betty White came marching into the room, having somehow gotten past all the hospital security. Aurora flew in behind her, settling on the windowsill where her feathers cast dancing lights across the ceiling. "Well," Dr. Zhang laughed, "I guess we have some extra helpers." The delivery was quick and peaceful, accompanied by Aurora's gentle song. When the baby finally arrived, everyone in the room gasped. Little Mary Victoria Reed was beautiful, but she was also glowing softly, tiny patterns like starlight shifting across her skin. Betty White clucked approvingly and presented a new pearl egg, which hatched the moment it touched the baby's blanket. Inside was a tiny chick with feathers that matched the patterns on Mary Victoria's skin. A guardian, Sarah understood immediately. Just like Betty White, news of the magical birth spread quickly. The alien sent a congratulatory message in the form of a shower of shooting stars that spelled out "welcome" in the night sky. The sister farms around the world reported extraordinary harvests that day, as if the whole planet was celebrating. Even Richard Davenport, still serving his time at the Arizona farm, felt the magic. The hard desert ground beneath his feet suddenly sprouted flowers, the same kind that grew in Mary's garden back in Paradise Valley. 5 years passed in what seemed like the blink of an eye. Paradise Valley had become a model for communities around the world. The Reed Foundation's network of farms was helping solve hunger and environmental problems in ways nobody had thought possible. And at the center of it all was the original farm, still simple, still humble, but filled with more magic than ever. Mary Victoria grew into a remarkable child. She could sing like Aurora, understand the chickens like Betty White, and make things grow with just a touch of her hand. But more importantly, she had her father's kindness and her mother's strength. Her best friend was the chick that had hatched from Betty White's egg, now grown into a beautiful hen named Starlight. One bright morning, as Mary Victoria collected eggs with Starlight, something extraordinary happened. In the same corner where Samuel had found the first golden egg all those years ago, there was a nest containing eggs from every special chicken on the farm. As the little girl watched, the eggs hatched simultaneously. The chicks that emerged were like nothing they'd seen before, each one unique, each one magical in its own way. One could make rain fall from clear skies, another could heal sick plants with its song, a third could show visions of distant places through its feathers. "The next generation," Sarah said when she saw them, "just like our Mary Victoria." That evening they had a visitor they'd been expecting. The alien ship returned right on schedule for its yearly visit, but this time was different. As the rainbow light beamed down, the aliens invited Mary Victoria to come aboard. Just for a little while, they communicated. To see where Aurora came from, to understand her heritage, Samuel and Sarah looked at their daughter, who was practically bouncing with excitement. They weren't afraid. They knew she would be safe. The aliens had become like family over the years. As Mary Victoria boarded the ship with Starlight and Aurora, her skin glowing brighter than ever, she turned to wave. "I'll be back for evening chores," she promised. "Betty White would never forgive me if I didn't help with the chickens." Betty White clucked in agreement, watching proudly as her human grandchild and her magical descendants rose into the sky. Samuel held Sarah close as they watched the ship disappear among the stars. "Mary would love seeing all this," he said softly. "She does see it," Sarah replied. "She's been part of every miracle since the beginning." And she was right. Mary's love had started it all. Her love for Samuel, for the farm, for the simple magic of everyday life. That love had attracted a miracle from the stars. It had transformed a humble chicken coop into a bridge between worlds. It had turned a failing farm into the heart of a global movement. It had changed Richard Davenport from an enemy into an ally, had given Victoria a chance to heal old wounds, and had brought Sarah into Samuel's life. Now that love lived on in their daughter, in the magical chickens, in every seed planted, and every egg laid on farms around the world, it was proving what Mary had always said, that love was the most powerful force in the universe, capable of creating miracles every single day. As the sun set over Paradise Valley, Betty White gathered her extraordinary flock into the coop. Aurora's evening song filled the air with colors. Samuel and Sarah sat in their usual spots on the porch, waiting for their daughter to return with stories of the stars. In his desert farm, Richard looked up at the same sky, finally at peace with himself. In her office, Victoria reviewed plans for new sister farms, her heart full of purpose. In laboratories and fields around the world, scientists and farmers worked together, learning to blend earthly wisdom with cosmic wonders. And somewhere, Mary watched over it all, smiling at how a simple farmer's faith had opened the door to infinite possibilities. She had always known that love could change the world. She just hadn't known it would change other worlds too. But then again, maybe she had. After all, she was the one who had always said that on a simple farm in Paradise Valley, anything was possible. All you needed was love, faith, and maybe a few magical chickens. The end.